Okay, picture this. It's 451 AD. On a vast, open plain in what we now call France, two enormous armies are about to collide in a battle that will literally decide the fate of Europe. It's called one of history's most important battles. But the real story of who won and what that victory even meant, well, that's where things get really interesting and a lot more complicated than the legends let on. For centuries, the story was pretty straightforward. You had historians like Edward Creasy who painted this epic, world-saving picture. A clear line in the sand. The heroic West stands up to the terrifying Huns and scores a massive win. And for a long, long time, that was the only story you'd hear. But what if it's not quite that simple? So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with the two legendary commanders squaring off. Then we'll dig into the surprisingly personal reasons this whole thing kicked off. We'll get into the chaos of the battle itself. And then we're going to get critical. We'll question the numbers, we'll challenge who the real winner was, and try to figure out the true legacy of this bloody, confusing, and absolutely critical moment in history. At the heart of this whole conflict, you've got two of the most incredible figures of the 5th century. And this wasn't just a clash of faceless armies. It was a showdown between two men who actually knew each other, maybe even respected each other, and were now locked in a fight for the future of their entire world. So, in one corner, you have Attila the Hun. His nickname? The Scourge of God. Yikes, this guy led a massive confederation of tribes that stretched all the way from Central Asia to Germany. And in the other corner, Flavius Aetius, a brilliant Roman general they called the last of the Romans because, well, the whole empire was basically counting on him. And get this, he'd spent years living with the Huns as a hostage, so he knew exactly how they thought and fought. I mean, just listen to how the Gothic historian Jordanes described Attila. He's not just saying he was a great general. He's saying the idea of Attila, the rumors about him, were enough to terrify all of mankind. The guy wasn't just a military leader. He was a psychological weapon. His reputation for pure ruthlessness was his greatest asset. So what kicks off a conflict of this scale? You might just think, well, the Huns invaded, duh. But oh, the real reasons are so much messier and, honestly, way more fascinating. It's this wild mix of politics, personal drama, and cold, hard strategy. Okay, check this out. First, you've got this insane story about Honoria, the Roman emperor's own sister. To get out of a marriage she didn't want, she sends her ring to Attila. He decides, hey, this is a marriage proposal, and demands half the entire Western Roman Empire as her dowry. Then you've got a civil war among the Franks, with two brothers picking Attila and Aetius as their respective backers. And, the final straw, the Visigoths were protecting some nobles who'd run away from Attila's rule. It was the perfect storm of excuses for Attila to finally invade. With the stage set, Attila crosses the Rhine and just starts wrecking shop, sacking city after city. Aetius knows he can't beat him alone, so he has to pull off a diplomatic miracle. He convinces his old enemies, the powerful Visigoths, to join him. When these two massive, multicultural armies finally clash, it's one of the most chaotic and diverse battles in history. They called it the Battle of Nations, and for good reason. The fighting was so intense, it actually started the night before the main event, with a massive skirmish that reportedly left 15,000 dead. The real battle doesn't even kick off until late afternoon, with both sides desperately fighting for control of a ridge. It's just a brutal, swirling mess. In the chaos, the Visigothic king, Theodoric, gets thrown from his horse and is trampled to death, probably by his own men. But that just enrages the Visigoths. They surge forward in a wave of fury and get so close to Attila that he's forced to retreat back into his fortified camp for the night. So what was this camp? It was a classic tactic of steppe nomads called a wagon legger, and it's genius. It's not just a place to park your supplies, it's a mobile fortress. You just circle up the wagons and suddenly your vulnerable camp becomes a defensive stronghold where your archers can pick off anyone who tries to attack. It was Attila's last line of defense. And please, don't make the mistake of thinking Attila was just some brute leading a screaming horde. No way. Modern historians think his plan was incredibly sophisticated. It might have even copied tactics from famous Greek battles, like the Battle of Leuctra. The idea was to load up one side of his army with his best troops, use them to smash his enemy's strongest unit, the Visigoths, and let the rest of his army just hold the line. This wasn't a wild charge. It was a calculated risk to break the enemy coalition at its strongest. So we have this absolutely epic, mythic story of the battle. But this is where we need to put on our historian hats, because when you start to look at the details, especially the numbers, the legend begins to get a little shaky. So, get this. Our main source, the historian Jordanes, claims that Attila marched into Gaul with 500,000 men. 500,000. For an ancient army, that number is it's almost impossible to even imagine. The ancient writers just loved gigantic numbers. Jordanes claims 165,000 men died in a single afternoon. Another writer, Aetius, puts the number at an unbelievable 300,000. But modern historians bring a little reality to the situation. They ask a simple question. How on earth do you feed and supply an army the size of a modern city in 451 AD? The answer is, you probably don't. So their estimates are much, much lower, maybe 30,000 to 40,000 men on Attila's side. Still, a massive army for the time, but not the biblical horde from the stories. And all this leads us to the central mystery of the whole affair. For hundreds of years, this was pitched as a decisive Roman victory that saved Western civilization. But was it, really? Because what happens right after the battle paints a very, very different picture. This is the million-dollar question. Okay, the battle's over. Attila is wounded, his army is bloodied, and he's cornered in his wagon fort. Legend says he was so sure he was going to be killed that he built his own funeral pyre out of horse saddles. He's a sitting duck. The allies have him trapped. And then, Aetius just lets him go. Why? Why would you do that if you just won? Well, it's because Aetius was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He was a Roman, and he knew that the enemy of your enemy is your friend for a little while. He realized that completely destroying the Huns would create a new, bigger problem. A super powerful Visigothic kingdom led by their young, ambitious new king, Thorsmund. Aetius needed a balance of power, so he brilliantly manipulates Thorsmund, telling him he'd better rush home and secure his crown before his brothers steal it. The Visigoths leave, the fragile alliance shatters, and Attila's army is allowed to just slip away. A genius political move for sure, but not what you do after a total victory. And if you need one final piece of evidence that this was no crushing defeat for the Huns, here it is. The very next year, Attila is back. This time, he doesn't just raid the frontier, he invades Italy itself and burns city after city to the ground. That is not the action of a broken and defeated army. So if it wasn't a clear victory and it didn't really stop the Huns for long, why on earth are we still talking about this battle? Why does it matter? Because its true legacy isn't about the outcome of that one bloody day, but about what it represented for the future of Europe. You can think of the Catalaunian Plains as the high watermark of the Hunnic Empire. It was the first time Attila's advance into the west was stopped dead in its tracks. For Rome, it was a last brilliant flash of glory, the final great military victory of the Western Empire before it crumbled. And for the Visigoths and the Franks, it was their coming out party. It showed they were now major powers who could stand as equals with Rome. It proved that this new, fractured Europe could, when it absolutely had to, come together. In the end, the battle leaves us with a really fascinating question. How much of the history we learn is what actually happened, and how much is just a really good story that's been polished over the centuries? The legend is a simple, heroic victory. The reality is a messy, ambiguous political stalemate. And it's a powerful reminder that history isn't always a clean story. And sometimes the most confusing victories are the ones that really do change the world.